Kia ora. My name is Paul Chartrand and I'm a visual artist from Canada. I'm super excited and honored to be able to participate in such a lively and unique conference. Before beginning, I'd like to extend gratitude to our host for putting together such a wonderful program. With this presentation, I'd like to try and present a brief overview of the historical trends of humans in affecting the landscape broadly. Following a concise list of historical trends that have culminated in current attitudes toward wilderness and ferality, I will present some examples of visual artists that engage directly with ferality. I will not be adding much in the way of text to my slides, preferring instead to use the images alone so that we can reflect on them. However, if anyone would like my notes or the spelling of particular artists, please don't hesitate to contact me. Until recently, the agricultural revolution, including animal husbandry and raising crops, was largely believed to have been started around 9500 BCE, but in 2015, Israeli archaeologists found evidence of agricultural activity starting near the Sea of Galilee back in about 23,000 years, almost double the original estimates. Since these early days of plant and animal domestications, cultures have sought ways in which to tame feral species. Fears of the wilderness have permeated human culture and stories for millennia, often for specific survival reasons. Besides our initial forays into agriculture for the sake of producing food, many peoples have undertaken projects under the umbrella term of gardening. The etymology of this word refers to enclosure. It's from the Middle English word garden, Anglo-French jardin, or of Germanic origin, akin to the Old High German gard or gart, which translates as an enclosure or compound. Eventually, cultivation of plants became more than about simply providing sustenance. Cultures began growing and arranging plants for aesthetic, economic, and even philosophical purposes. Earlier iterations of these gardens were innovated by Mesopotamian cultures over 3,500 years ago, with famous examples such as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Eventually, this obsession with alteration of the landscape spread and developed into highly specific forms of cultural expression. At various points in history, humans have expressed their preferences for wilderness or domestication in varying degrees. The following examples are only a few of a wide range of practices from around the world at various times. Japanese gardens were and are renowned for their deliberate focus on the beauty of nature combined with Zen philosophies. Often surrounded by a hedge or fence, the trees in these gardens were accented with brightly colored flowers such as irises and lilies. Running water was a key feature, emphasizing the flow of time. Uniquely, rocks were a strong focus, sometimes even more so than the plants themselves, arranged carefully and generally highlighted by moss or lichen. French gardens tended to be much more formal and rigidly geometric, focusing on triangles, spheres, and right angles. Crisply pruned bushes and trees were accented by brightly colored flowers and sometimes even culinary vegetables and herbs such as lavender. Lavish water features were sought after as focal points in more extravagant gardens such as the ones at the Palace of Versailles. English gardens were developed as an informal counterpoint to these more strictly geometric French gardens of the early 1700s. Pioneered by landscape architects like William Kent, who was sometimes even said to plant dead trees in order to create the moods he desired, these gardens were designed to feel more unsymmetrical, free, and wild. Creeping, vining plants growing on support structures are often mixed with flowers, with a full but uncrowded aesthetic. Generally, they were intended to feel relaxed, often including benches for sitting. Now, before we continue, I think it'd be appropriate to briefly introduce the term rewilding as it relates to our conversation about working with wilderness and gardening. Rewilding is a newer concept that developed out of the conservation efforts of John Muir. He was born in Scotland in 1838, immigrating to America with his family in 1849. There, Muir developed an early love of wilderness and was a key figure in developing national parks, specifically Yosemite, as well as the Sierra Club, which continues to this day. Muir's preferred model of conservation was preservation. He challenged the view of nature as a resource to be exploited, such as with the burgeoning forest industry, and felt that it had a value of its own, being especially relevant spiritually. Here I need to note that Moyer's complex relationship with the First Nations groups oscillated between respect and derision. Despite the associations of John Moyer with conservation and rewilding, these efforts have come at a significant cost to Indigenous peoples. Most notably, many Indigenous groups have been displaced during the creation of these national parks. Now, shifting from this historical context, I'd like to focus on some contemporary artistic engagements with gardening as they pertain specifically to ferality. Although I'm interested in projects that contain more explicit mergers of human technology with natural systems via techniques like hydroponic gardening, such as the case with the incredible sculptures of Amy Young's, I'll remain focused on projects that deal more specifically with wilder forms. I also want to quickly address the term agency that I'll be using. When I say agency, I'm referring to the potential of an actor to act and to affect others. This extends beyond common conceptions of will or spirit, so that agency can also be found in non-humans and even inanimate non-humans. I consider these following works to be gardening because of the presence of the human hand and the conceptual underpinnings that ground the aesthetic. However, what I believe to be most valuable about these projects is the artist's ability to release some of their own control, allowing the natural collaborators to display their own abilities to act. These projects are also generally quite closely linked to the idea of rewilding, which has become so important and controversial since the times of John Moyer. Many contemporary artists have become fascinated with the idea of weeds, wild plants, or undesirable nature, rather than illustrating idealized notions of wilderness, as in the admittedly attractive large-scale public murals of weeds by Mona Caron. We will focus here on living works. What I think is most interesting about the following artists is their direct engagement with plants as opposed to depictions or models. To begin, I'll use the Giuseppe Licari's project Registered to get us thinking about what constitutes a natural landscape. Despite the landscape of Tuscany often being praised for its natural beauty, Licari wanted us to pay attention to the fact that it is actually designed. In 2013, Licari directly intervened on the valley landscape, posing a question to the people living there and to the tourists visiting the area. He used a tractor to till a registered trademark symbol into the hillside of Val d'Orcia. He wanted to provoke questions like, to whom does this landscape really belong? Or who has the ownership of its beauty and harmony? Licari says in his project description, quote, everything was designed, reshaped, and destroyed, and finally protected, resulting in the valley as we see it now. Seen from the main square of Castiglioncello del Trinoro, the registered trademark symbol looks like an alien sign in a human landscape. Alan Sonfest's Time Landscape was conceptualized in 1965, planted in 1978, and continues to the present. It consists of plants that were native to the New York City area in pre-colonial times. The chosen site is a rectangular plot of 25 feet by 40 feet, situated in Lower Manhattan at the northeast corner of LaGuardia Place and West Houston Street. The New York City Department of Parks and Recreation describes the artwork as, quote, when it was first planted, Time Landscape portrayed the three stages of forest growth from grasses to saplings to grown trees. However, since then, these stages have become blurred. The southern part of the plot represented the youngest stage and now has birch trees and beaked hazelnut shrubs with a layer of wildflowers beneath. The center features a small grove of beech trees above ground cover of smaller plants. The northern area is a mature woodland dominated by oaks with a scattered white ash and American elm trees. Sonfest's intention was to create a natural memorial akin to war memorials. One of the most important aspects of Sonfest's project that we'll see throughout the other artists presented is that it questions what is natural. Post-colonial plants intrude into the park, and on one hand, Sonfest has stated that he is not bothered with weeding them out, but on the other, the evocation of the past is what distinguishes it from other green areas. New York's Department of Parks and Recreation has since taken to periodically weeding out invaders and incinerating them. When the weeds are left to populate the space, how does it affect the work? Is it possible that there's simply a new equilibrium being sought out by the plants themselves, whether pre- or post-colonial? Sonfest is sometimes grouped in with the early land artists such as Michael Heiser and Robert Smithson. However, rather than carving the land and exerting the human will onto it, he was interested in peeling back the layers of history in a city over the centuries to remind us of the lost places that were once beneath. Hans Hacke's Bowery Seats project from 1970 placed clean soil on the roof of the building in New York in which his studio was contained at the time. The mound was quickly taken over by plants whose seeds were delivered by air or in the excrement of passing birds. This garden is one of the examples of the least human interference I can find in an artwork. Hacke initiates the work with a simple action, piling soil on the roof, and natural processes do the rest. In this way, the pile of soil almost seems like a proposition for the project itself. Similar iterations of the project in the form of seed catcher and pool of earth were also developed. All of these projects had in common the unpredictability of the final outcome, but the near certainty that nature would find a way to populate this virgin patch of soil. Opportunities are seldom wasted in ecology, and this seems to be a core message of the work. Hacke's project seems in some ways radically different than the specifically chosen forest ecology of Sonfest's pre-colonial forest. However, it also seems to be more effectively communicating the unsentimental nature in which plants always seem to find a way. Lois Weinberger's Wild Cage Garden series, which started in 1991, presents us with a similar project to Hacke's. However, it seems to have a more specific political twist. These gardens are more deliberately sculptural in that they consist of metal cages which enclose a space. Although initially devoid of plants, these spaces become gradually populated with various forms of vegetation. The political twist I mentioned refers to the inaccessibility of these spaces to human interference. The cages can be seen to act as a protection from human destruction, but they also appear to be a sort of absurd, ineffectual prison for the plants. We are presented with an interesting binary of protection/imprisonment of the plants. Additionally, the cages allow parts of the plants to grow outward, and in the case of some trees and shrubs, grow around and engulf the metal itself, as an effective reminder of the power of plants to push past human-imposed boundaries. Weinberger sometimes characterizes his actions as being, quote, precise carelessness, unquote. It is a poetic negation of the tendency of capitalism to intently manage and control growth for its own purposes. In this way, the wild cubes seem more like the initiation of an anarchist squat rather than the building of a permanent apartment building, which I liken to the sowing of a garden. Weinberger also performs works without the cage, which he calls cuts, which began in 1999, where a layer of earth is scraped off in a long line. These cuts quickly become colonized by wind-blown plants of opportunity. The artist was inspired by the spontaneous growth of plants in the death strip between sides of the Berlin Wall. According to the artist's website, quote, his radical poetics of the rudderel is a counterpoint to the anthropocentric ideal of primary nature, acting against the aesthetics of the pure and the true, against the ordering forces, unquote. The drifts of wild vegetation that grow relentlessly on post-industrial wastelands at the periphery of urban life are far more untamed and therefore more natural than the tightly controlled zones of contemporary wilderness. These plants are ready to break through the surface of the city at any opportunity, cracking the veneer of human order and stability. It seems to me that despite the resemblance of this work to the old land artists and their delvings into the earth, Weinberger seems to operate as a sort of eccentric archaeologist. With his cuts, he simply exposes the earth to the conditions necessary to allow it to reveal its own path. Many of us are familiar with the public sculpture parks that populate college campuses and public parks, but how often do we consider the possibilities of the spaces underwater? Jason DeSera's Tyler's Reefs, created from 2006 to the present, may be underwater, but I still wanted to draw attention to them based on their relationship to the feral. These projects involve the construction of figurative sculptures in pH-neutral materials that may be easily colonized by algae and coral when installed underwater. By predominantly using local models for the life casts, he's also aiming to empower local coastal communities and provide an important icon of residents standing in defense of their seas. Some of Dessert's sculptures are solitary, but the majority are grouped together in communities, which seems appropriate given the nature of a coral reef. Just as a reef is a community, so too does Dessert present his societies of sculpted people. Dessert's figurative sculptures are rife with poetics, but I think that the most poignant might be also one of the most straightforward, that humans are nature. His work with reefs are intended to draw attention to the ways in which corals around the world are being rapidly destroyed by either direct physical damage from fishing, tourism, and storms, as well as climatic changes and the rise of acidity of the oceans. One of the greatest benefits of artificial reefs is that they have lifted the pressure off of natural reefs, in which over the past few decades have been overfished and overvisited. By diverting attention to artificial reefs, natural reefs have now been able to have a chance to repair and regenerate. With this more deliberate efforts toward creating an environment, Dessert's is following a different sort of rewilding that focuses on a community collaboration between human and non-human efforts. Jenny Kendler is an artist with a couple of projects that poetically reinvigorate the landscape. Milkweed Dispersal Balloons from 2014 is a self-described food cart for monarch butterflies, which has been traveling to museums, farmers markets, and other public venues along the path of North American monarch migrations. Visitors to the cart are given clear, biodegradable balloons filled with the seeds of milkweed, the only plant on which monarchs feed. When participants take the balloons back to their neighborhoods and pop them, releasing the fluffy floating seeds, they become the agents of seed dispersal. There, the resilient plants find places to grow in parkways, backyards, and alleys to feed the monarchs for years to come. Working with her audience in this way, Candler is able to drastically increase the project's potential. In addition, she highlights the agency shared between herself, the participants, the monarch butterflies, and the milkweed itself. Thus, Candler effectively but subtly encourages participants to contemplate their roles in this interwoven ecological community. In another one of her works from 2015 to 2017, Sculpture Garden, Candler produces statues similar to ancient Greek figurative statues. Instead of traditional marble, however, these statues are cast with earth and seeds native to the American prairie where the work was installed. In these works, the perfection of white marble is countered with the beautiful perfect/imperfectness of earth, seeds, and wild-growing plants, suggesting that we, artists and humans, perhaps cannot hope to rival the wild, perfect and imperfect beauty of the natural world. Sculpture Garden helps us to envision a counterpoint to the aesthetic historical justification for human exceptionalism, reminding us that we belong to the natural world and not the other way around. Even the human body itself is a part of the cycles of nature, eventually going back to the earth to nurture future growth. As a final deliberate counterpoint to the projects listed above, I wanted to include the art collaboration called Critical Art Ensemble. They engage political issues surrounding ecology using deliberately provocative projects that warn of agricultural practices gone awry. In their Sterile Field project from 2013, we have a presentation of the havoc placed on field ecology by Roundup-ready crops. Most fields have numerous plants and species that share the space with crops. Some life cycles collapse because elements of the field food chain are so thoroughly eliminated by Roundup-ready herbicide. Critical Art Ensemble prepared an artificial plot of land with Roundup-ready herbicide and challenged people to try and grow something in the enriched soil. In spite of assorted attempts, the area remained dead. Just as many of the projects I presented here offer a balanced interplay of human and non-human agency, Critical Art Ensemble delivers a startlingly dystopian but realistic message about the current state of mainstream agricultural processes. In this way, it is important to remember the power of art to provoke responses from the viewer with the hope to drive change. With this presentation of artists working with feral gardens, my intention was not to imply that conventional gardening is a malicious activity, although arguably some certainly would given the rigorous removal of unwanted species. Traditional gardening methods are simply a more direct assertion of human will onto the land. These artists I've presented have many lessons to offer, but for me, one of the most important has been to simply shut up and listen. The plants have a will of their own. Kia ora. Thanks so much for listening. I look forward to the discussions around this topic and the others in our conference.